And for those of you who are coming back to this fourth conversation, welcome back. Things are getting lively at the kitchen. And for those of you who are just joining the conversation, we're going to put a link into the chat to a document that has overviews of the last three webinars, links to materials and resources that were shared, and links and information about all the folks who are going to be sharing today. So you can go there and kind of get yourself oriented to where we've been, where we're at, and where we're headed. Good to see you, Peter. Peter Bratt from Friendship House, doing some amazing work in San Francisco with indigenous people of many nations in the Bay, getting healthy and getting free. Robert from Beneficial, welcome. Thank you all for putting your names in the chat as you come on in. Let's see here. Fred, hey Fred, good to see you. Fred from the San Francisco Foundation. We mic here in the middle once we start talking about community foundations and racial justice and equitable leadership, because you've been doing it. So we might have to call on some of your wisdom in this conversation. Camilla from Dolores Huerta Foundation, welcome. Lots of friends and family joining the call. Anthony from Kitchen Table Advisors, getting our regenerative food system up and going, supporting all those small people of color farmers trying to keep us all fed. Nashira from Birth Center Equity Fund, welcome. So we're at 50. I think that's an auspicious number right there. So maybe we should just begin. So welcome again to the fourth in the series of the Equitable Development Working Group. Host Kat Taylor and Harold and the team at Regenesis Institute and the rest of us who are part of this working group. So welcome back. We've got a really exciting some storytelling to happen today, some honest conversation to happen at the kitchen table. So thank you for coming to be a part of it. And for those of you who are just joining, our first two set of conversations dove deeply into the work of equitable development, just transition in four communities. In Spartansburg, where Harold and Regenesis built out a really transformative model, comprehensive model for community development there. And then we heard from folks in Memphis and Richmond, California, Buffalo, New York, heard a little bit about their just transition journey. And then in the last webinar, we sort of turned both to the question of what it will take to sort of scale equitable development to meet the real needs that exist in communities, and focused on what that means in the context of this global uprising to defend Black lives, to divest from policing in prisons and harm, and reinvest in community well-being and in safety. And we heard from Rakia from Jackson and the Movement for Black Lives about the work that she and many others are doing to support folks who are system impacted and formulating to build alternatives as we divest, and what it's going to take to reinvest at scale. And that was the bulk of our last conversation. And this conversation is about the gathering, the mavericks and the code breakers and the innovators in philanthropy, banking, and finance who've been working hard to develop innovative solutions in collaboration with communities and movements to really shift capital in the ways and at the scale that's needed to ensure that all of our communities can thrive. So that's what we're gonna turn it over to our host of the kitchen table, Kat Taylor, who's gonna share some words and some wisdom and get us going. So welcome and thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Taj. So start with a song. Wanna believe that you don't have a bad bone in your body, but the bruises on your ego make you go, why, I wanna believe that even when you're stone cold, you're sorry. Tell me why you gotta be so out of your mind. I know you're from your fears. Already told you I'm right here. I'll stay by your side every night. I don't know why you hide from no one and close your eyes to the one, mess up and lie to the one that you love. When you know you can cry to the one, always confide in the one. You can be kind to the one that you love. So please think of this as a confession. I have learned from so many of you. I am parroting back. I'm not white-splaining. I'm trying to understand it myself and incorporate it into my actions in life. And I wrote it down and I'm reading it because I didn't want to leave anything out or get anything wrong. So here we go. And then we're going to have an amazing with the rest of our speakers in the kitchen table conversation. In wondering how one knows that liberation, self-determination, and joy for Black Americans is liberation for all, and how tolerating colonized wealth and white supremacy is just as bad for white progress as for Black progress, I think back to my own experience at the youngest of age. My first memories, other than biting my brother, for which I got in huge trouble, were of what I think of as the civil rights funerals. In rapid succession, we watched evil forces cut down JFK, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, and Malcolm X. And during that time of learning, inadequately given the bias in our history books, but nonetheless, at least realizing that our country was founded on enslavement of African Americans, genocide of and land theft from Native Americans, persecution of immigrants and refugees, less than personhood for women, and the utter despoliation of our natural commons, it seemed impossible to comprehend how I was ever going to be happy in a society that had capitalized on so many evils. But guilt is a strong motivator, and imagination always precedes accomplishment. So without further ado, I set out to find my place in the correction of so many wrongs. Fast forward years later and come to find that my journey has led to a firm belief that unless we transfer assets back to those from whom they were taken, directly or indirectly, we will not reach the beloved community to which MLK hearkened. So I am dedicated to putting more and different people in charge, not just with resources like grants, but with assets that build wealth and power, and with an eye toward transforming economic and societal structures that are part of the problem. I know that I'm a nerd, but it helps me to go back to theory, especially theory that's uncomfortable, because it gives us insights into what and how we must change the distribution of money and therefore power in our current society. I will be a student of restorative economics with the help of experts like Amaka today, but the theory which I was exposed before came mostly during business school, where I was a naif, someone who had no background in economics or finance and no preconceived notion of what those systems could or were producing. 3 revelations in particular stick with me to this day. A professor explained the concept of Pareto optimality, which is the notion that 2 parties will only engage in transactions that are mutually beneficial. He demonstrated by plotting on a graph of guns and butter 2 individuals, one with X amount of guns and Y amount of butter, 2X the amount of guns and 2Y the amount of butter. Then when he identified the mutually beneficial exchanges, it created a little pillow between the 2 points of endowment called a Pareto optimality pillow, which seemed perfectly natural to him and the class. But the only thing I could see was that everything was dependent upon those initial endowments. And if you can't change your initial endowments, then you can't really change your outcomes in life. The other teachings from the law school that bothers me to this day demonstrated how our economic models often obscure the truth and rationalize cruelty and oppression. In land use class, the professor literally said, Thank goodness we have pollution, because that's how we get affordable housing. Every community steward on this call can false causality of that statement. Our economic and political systems impose intentionally pollution and all sorts of other ills on communities low in power and opportunity. But it also points out the cognitive dissonance that allows people to accept cruelty and oppression in order to maintain their own hoarding. And it reveals an opportunity set that Harold Mitchell and his community used to full advantage, transforming 2 Superfund and 4 brownfield sites into community health clinics, owned and affordable rental homes, hydroponic agriculture, and destination community assets. And then there's the concept of intermediary between you and power hijacks it for their own agenda. Many of us donors have had financial or investment advisors who prize more their track record than our impact, much less asset transfer. I recall Confluence hosted workshops on firing your investment manager as a result. I really had no assets until my husband became an investor and realized a lot of success. We practiced classic grant making at first, but increasingly wanted to have more impact for all the reasons cited above. About 20 years ago, we decided to focus on 3 big systems that need radical transformation: money, food, and politics. I'll stick to capital today, but note that soils and land are critical natural capital as well, and should be thought of in the asset transfer goals. First, we started Beneficial State Bank. We think of banking as the original and most powerful form of crowdfunding. Not that a single deposit funds a single loan, but all deposits fund a lending practice. And we sought to reawaken the agency and accountability, the choice and the responsibility of depositors over where their deposits sleep at night. That part was pretty successful, but we realized shortly into it that our borrowers were trapped in Pareto optimality. There is no amount of debt that overcomes barriers of not having equity. We could do a lot of good in marginally creating access to bank finance and keeping people aligned in their deposits, but a bank is not the best way to create wealth by transferring assets among those deprived of those initial endowments. So next we started a venture fund called Radical Impact Partners. Less than 2% of venture funding goes to women or BIPOC entrepreneurs. We are shifting the access to venture funding. Again, lack of initial endowments disadvantages BIPOC and women-led teams, from anything of lack of startup capital to poor access to advanced degrees to implicit bias against diverse teams in recognition of their lack of social and political capital necessary to win in our biased marketplaces. Still, we persist. So we looked at reform of philanthropy. To me, charity is an admission of failure. If we ran society right in the first place, no one would need charity because they would have good initial endowments, self-determination, control over assets, and therefore power and opportunity. There will also be acts of misfortune, so perhaps some income transfer will always be needed, but far better that it comes from owning assets or collective agreements for minimum basic income meant assets. Moreover, philanthropy, like loans and investments, are vestiges of colonial power and long-standing concentrations of power in white hands that must, in Edgar Villanueva's parlance, be decolonized. But we do have charity as a dominant model, and host organizations and industry have grown up around that model that are resistant to change naturally. If your business model is dependent upon assets under management, which is nearly inescapable, then you need a new business model that allows a just transition. We shouldn't expect institutions to fire a bunch of philanthropy employees with impunity any more than expect coal miners and their communities to go quietly into obsolescence. We need just transitions all over the economy. We are not just tinkering around with the rules of philanthropy, therefore, in terms of grant making, but we are going to the heart of it and into how assets are managed, invested, and transferred over time, which has allowed us to look beyond simple changes of the IRS tax code or the Attorney General's authorities to how do we entice the hosting organizations to change their business model because it is a way more sustainable and impactful. So we are in talks with Black-led financial reform shops who have developed a tweak to the Opportunity Zone finance rules that solves for the lack of community engagement, community benefit, and community ownership. And that could draw those $6 trillion of capital gains off the sideline into funding community ownership and individual Black wealth. We are also discussing using donor-advised fund assets to increase the capacity of nonprofit organizations with government partnership to issue nonprofit bonds proceeds to build community assets. Over time, we seek the transfer of those assets to community ownership, the land, housing, energy systems, and everything else needed to create a beloved community and hold it in common. We are actively working on policy and legislation to increase the reporting and accountability of all philanthropy, from private foundations to donor-advised funds, to make sure that charity, which we must have, follows a dollar out the door philosophy, not an assets under management one, unless those assets are aligned in the process of transference. Philanthropy assets are working against grants because they are largely invested in fossil fuels, the prison military complex, and industrial ag. So we are in favor of divesting, but divesting only gets you part of the way. We need to increase our capacity to reinvest and also favor the models for new ownership like cooperatives and land trusts. Our focus is on shifting the mindset of foundations from creating codependency through eking out grants versus allowing forgivable debt to redound to community or resident ownership of assets. It makes no sense to provide investment capital to BIPOC, LGBTQ, and female community stewards without changing also the investment menu. We simply cannot solve for pattern if we allow cruel white supremacy capitalism to rule the day. And when philanthropy is an admission of a failed society, then perpetuity of philanthropy is not a good goal. Harold Mitchell just this morning informed my thinking more when he noted, quote, "Today's webinar is so timely. I don't know if you've had a chance to review the Biden Climate Environmental Justice Plan that has an emphasis on 3 agencies, HHS, DOJ, and EPA. Folks are so excited in the sausage-making process until they're missing the point of focusing on the entire federal family of agencies, especially those with the most resources and expertise. Today's webinar is a perfect example of how commerce and economic development is a paradigm shift to incentivize differently the equitable development opportunities for the failed Opportunity Zone designations. Don't forget about Treasury. Capital and ownership has always been the hurdle. As Full Spectrum Capital reminds us, on the migration from an extracted to a restorative economy, we must be honest about when strategies are retrenching, which is an activity that seems good on the face of it, but actually reinforces the status quo in very destructive ways, or are genuinely bridging strategies to get us from the status quo closer to the ideal of beloved communities. If they were, for instance, to pledge DAF assets as credit enhanced to the public serving nonprofit organizations, then those nonprofits would be improving the balance sheets of our communities and our community organizations. Muhammad Yunus, the founder of the Grameen Bank and other economic innovations, recently told me that he is working in coalition to design a new civilization. Nothing less than that will suffice. For him, it's a society that yields zero poverty, zero unemployment, and zero carbon. But we can all imagine our own versions. Where I think we are as a civilization that must evolve is at the recognition that until assets are shared, shifted from those who have them to those who don't, we will not transcend our societal problems. We will miss the opportunity where when everybody owns a little bit of something, we all thrive, and when anybody owns too much of anything, we suffer. To me, that leads us to collective ownership models and individual wealth. That's one of the reasons I'm so thrilled that we will hear today from Aaron about the Black Cooperative Movement. Thank you very much for enduring the monologue.
The manifesto. Thank you, Kat. That was beautiful and inspiring and powerful. And what I think is so, what I'm also grateful for in this call is that you're speaking from experience as someone who's innovating and problem solving and generating new solutions, and the other people that we're going to hear from on this call are some of the most interesting and exciting innovators in the financial transformation sector that you'll ever meet. And when you hear the stories that everyone's going to share, and get a sense of how these solutions can sort of come together and add up to something more, what you'll realize is that we are trying to catch up to the communities. The communities are ahead of us in terms of they are more prepared to absorb capital than we have been able to deliver it. And so the hope is that out of this conversation, we can catch up. We can do some catching up. So I'm going to, let's see here, share my screen and offer a few more pieces before we get into some storytelling here. So let's see, screen share, my screen. There's that's what I'm looking for. And now you can all see this. Who can share? Only host, all panelists. Oh goodness, advanced sharing options. Who can share? All panelists. All right, there we go. So the work that I do now in relationship to this conversation is through a partnership called Full Spectrum Capital Partners. And as someone who spent many years working mostly with communities that were working with grants and government resources and foundations trying to support those communities, the communities we were working with started to realize that they needed access to more than just grants. And the work that they were doing fundamentally had to focus on not just building cultural power or political power, but economic power in the ways that allow for a different kind of self-determination. And so the focus of this work is really about community wealth building. And as Kat communicated really clearly, the transition in philanthropy, the transition in finance, the transition in banking is about the transfer of assets to community ownership, stewardship, management, and control. And that's the only form of economic power that can really help us to shift the systems in our society in the ways that we need to. So this conversation is really centered on strategies that help us to do that. And by full spectrum capital, we're talking about grants and debt and equity and land and soil and businesses and co-ops and all of the resources that are public resources in terms of our city budgets and our state budgets and our federal budgets, right? So we have to help our communities build the capacity to steward all forms of capital, all forms of economic power towards their vision, values, and transformative goals. Let's see here. So we think about sort of 4 strategies in the transformation of capital. The first one is divestment, take the money out of the harmful stuff. The second strategy is return, give back the stuff that you took, rematriate and return the land and the capital to the people and places from which it was extracted, to the places where the pain has been deepest and most sustained. The third strategy is about shift. It's about how we move investments out of Wall Street and into Main Street. And a lot of that strategy has to do with OISTA and NDN Collective and the CDFI infrastructure that can really clearly take resources and put it into the hands of the people who need it most, and the loan infrastructure that exists that's there to do that. And then the last thing we come back to is reinvestment, which is when we think about the capital that gets divested within markets, like how do we shift some of that into other market investment, significant triple bottom line impact investments that support people in the planet. So those are sort of the 4 strategies that we sort of work with. And as you mentioned, Kat, the part of the work we do is with what we call capital stewards or asset holders, people who have direct decision making over surplus capital and resources. Farhad likes to call them wealth hoarders, but we'll be nice today and we'll just talk about capital stewards. Farhad, you can do what you want when it's your turn. So yeah, the first question is, like, for each of us, how much do we need? Like, what is enough? And as Kat said beautifully, when each of us has what we need, but not too much, then everybody's going to be okay. There's so much abundance. There's so much abundance. So that's kind of the first question. Once you've answered that question, if you've got any left over, return it, shift it, reinvest it. It's pretty simple. So the stories you're going to hear from the other folks on this call are people who are doing different aspects of these four strategies. Some of them are doing all four. Some of them are focused on more than one or the other, but they're all essential and interlocking strategies if we're going to shift capital at the scale required. That's power. I'm done. You don't need to see any of this stuff. We need to get into the rest of the conversation here. Let's stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to turn it over to Anna, who is going to take us on a journey with some co-conspirators who have been cooking some stuff up.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be here with y'all again. I'm looking more and more forward to these conversations every time we have them because they're always so amazing. For folks who have been on the calls before, then you've heard a lot about Memphis, about me and my story and my journey in Memphis. And today I wanted to introduce you to some of the who have made our work in Memphis not just possible, but actually more full of integrity and more visionary. As y'all know, I'm a producer and a cultural strategist, and my journey to be a developer and to now talk about doing this work all over the South was really an unexpected one. And I depended a lot on the folks who showed up in support of our work to learn and to grow our models and to really integrate what we were already doing into some of the visionary work. And I want to introduce you to some of those women today. I want to introduce you to two of my favorite funders, Amaka Agbo and Lynn Hui, who are with the Restorative Economics Fund. And then I'm going to introduce you to Aaron Dale in 1 second. But and Lynn, and Amaka, can you talk a little bit about the Restorative Economics Framework? Because what I have come to realize, the work that we're doing in Memphis and that we're replicating across the South is really a really beautiful blend of my work around cultural strategy and culture shift frameworks and your around the restorative economics framework. So I would love for you to talk to folks about what that work looks like and get a glimpse inside of that.
Thank you, Anasa, for the introduction, and Taj and Kat and Farhad and Rachel and everybody on the screen. Thank you so much for having myself and my amazing colleague Lynn Hui from the Restorative Economies Fund present on our work today. This is actually the first time I've been introduced as a funder, so I'm trying this on as one of the many hats that I wear. But as an action, I come out of a long-term social racial justice organizing background, particularly in the Bay Area, but also nationally, and have done international work. And I think I started to do sort of economics framework around the same time on the East Coast, where we saw groups like the New Economy Coalition, Center for Economic Democracy, also formalizing their framework. So we started to see that coming out of the 2008 recession, there are a number of places across the country where people are trying to really figure out how do we start to interrogate how our financial systems have been working and how they have been structured to continue to hurt and harm Black and Brown communities. So Lynn and I have the pleasure of working on the Restorative Economies Fund, which is an integrated capital fund, where we're designed to move non-extractive capital to projects that are community owned and governed. And so to quickly go into it, I'm going to try to do screen share as well. And that's let me know if this is popping up for you. Yeah?
Yes, I can see it.
Cool. So one of the things that really stood out to me early on is, as I was trying to really, look into what was happening with our economy, was recognizing that as people were trying to really lean into questioning and developing alternative economic frameworks, that we still were continuing to miss the mark and having a very strong racial and race class analysis around our work. And I should also include a gender lens in there as well. And so for me, it became very important to be very explicit about who we are moving resources to, how we are moving those resources, and what are the projects that we are supporting. Because I found that even as people were starting to develop new economic models, we were still seeing the same white wealthy individuals get the majority of the dollars that were being invested into these new projects. And so for the work that Lynn and I do, we really look at prioritizing projects that are being led and owned by Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. And particularly, we're interested in supporting projects that are really trying to lean into a model of community stewardship. So not just looking at models that kind of entrench individual riches, but something that is starting to lift up the mechanisms for shared prosperity. We think it's important that communities are not just being told to wait until you get the social benefits like we may see out of a new market tax deal structure. So taking a critical look at who is getting the financial returns off a particular project. And so when we look at things like economic development is a particular area where the community is oftentimes reassured a number of jobs, reassured a certain amount of community green open spaces. But the people who actually get the financial returns off of those development projects continue to be people that sit outside of our communities and oftentimes are wider and wealthier. So really calling into question who owns the project and who is getting the financial returns. And then also looking at the community governance of the project as well. We want to ensure that people are really coming together to collectively make decisions about how to use this community asset. For us, we're very clear that voting is one aspect of the political activity we want to see in a community, but we really want to support projects that are engaging their surrounding community members and being active daily stewards of their projects. And that, as Taj was kind of mentioning, that at the end of the day, our work is not just about the redistribution of economic resources, but also looking at how are we ensuring that those communities that have been historically oppressed and harmed and extracted from are also building the political and cultural power that makes it possible for us to then lift up economic models that are new and non-extractive. And so I think I'll stop there. I had a few more slides, but I don't want to bore us because we've gone into the frameworks. I think we all get that communities have been doing this work for a number of years, and it's those of us that kind of sit in the Zoom rooms all need frameworks to understand what it actually takes so that we're closing the racial wealth divide. And so with Lynn has been an amazing partner in really translating the restorative economics framework into an investment due diligence and a set of frameworks that we can then invite people in to collectively co-invest in. And so we support projects like we were honored to support the historic Claiborne Temple, the work that Anasa has been leading in Memphis, along with the Orange Mound Development Complex by Vic, also in Memphis. So supporting equitable economic development projects, supporting community governed loan funds like Seed Commons, like the Runway with Jessica Norwood, and then also looking at infrastructure projects, those things that really support the connectivity of a people in a place. So looking at projects like renewables and others. So we're really trying to figure out how do we take the resources that we have access to, be in deep relationship with our partners on the ground, and move resources to them across the spectrum from startup and pre-development all the way into growth and stabilization, and doing that in a way that we're ensuring that we're actually leaving more value in the communities that we're supporting, but what we as investors and donors are sharing in that collective risk, because we actually understand that what's at stake is not just the financial returns to our fund, but actually what is the deepening of hurt and harm in the communities if we don't support them. And so would love to kind of, sorry, I talked really fast, but would love to pass it off to Lynn to see what else you might want to kind of add. Yeah, well, we've had the pleasure of supporting.
Lynn, as we pass it to you, if you could speak specifically about the integrated capital approach that REF has, it would be super helpful, I think, for folks who are listening in.
Yeah, thanks, Amaka. Thanks, Anasa. Hi, everyone. My name's Lynn Hoy. I work at Candide Group, and I'm the managing director of the Olamina Fund, and have the pleasure of supporting Amaka's amazing leadership on the Restorative Economies Fund work. It's like interesting to think about the investment piece of it, and I'll go into the integrated capital approach in a moment. I'm a former banker, like deep finance person. It's a constant unlearn, I would say, of the best practices that we're taught in banking and how to really keep wealth where it should be. And I can find this really critical moment when I was working in, gosh, I'm sick of lending money to rich white people to buy investment property. They don't invest in their communities. And that we're doing now with the Restorative Economies Fund in particular, which the whole process is centered around the community. And I think that's the critical difference in how things are looked at traditionally and how the restorative economy's approach and the framework that we're actualizing right now, really the first risk is, what is the risk of not doing this project? That's like the first question we ask. Because as was mentioned earlier, like communities know what we need. We're catching up with them. When you take that lens, you can just do so much more. It really becomes a relationship in reciprocity. What Anasa was talking about is this integrated capital approach. Prior to my time at Candide, I actually was I co-led the lending team at RSF, which was a key player in bringing the integrated capital framework to life. And what it is like, what does an organization need now to thrive? Financial, non-financial capital. So when we looked at the historic Claiborne Temple, for example, with Anasa's project, we knew that there was an immediate need to get the building secured in order to do the furtherance of the work, right? It was such a critical place in Memphis, both in terms of political power, historical power, and where it sits, it just had such an amazing opportunity to be the center of Memphis's culture, and its history. So I remember Anasa and I talking, and she's like, I think I want to get a loan. I'm like, I think what you actually need right now is a grant to secure this building. And like part of the integrated capital approach right there, which is like, actually, what is the right financial tool that's needed at this time with the urgency that was around purchasing it? And then we have a further conversation about, okay, when the building is secured, how do you layer on top of that? What operating grants do you need in order to be able to do the work and build the capacity to ensure that your vision thrives? What also is the access to networks, for example, introduce you to? Is it helpful? Amak and I went to Memphis and did a presentation. Is it helpful to come into the community work we're doing? Because we also believe that, we're sitting in California, so maybe I'm not sitting in California right now. It's dark outside, as you'll see, but we want local support to ensure that these projects will continue to have the community buy-in over the long term. So it's about how do we build a whole relationship. One of the things that I've learned since I moved from traditional finance into the work that I'm doing right now is like, I have been blessed and privileged to have the level of access to knowledge that I do. And one of my favorite things to do is like sit with people, the whole financial system and just call the whole thing. And I know Anas and I have had conversations about that, and Amaka, Jocelyn Wong and I had one the other day. So we're really coming up with a new innovating, as I say, where we look at the community risk first, and some of the questions we ask are, as I said, what is the cost of not doing this project? Does it have buy-in from key stakeholders? What is the ongoing feedback loop? Does the team have the capacity to support the project? And is success defined in terms of community impact as opposed to scale? Because impact investing loves to talk about scale. But scale is not what's going to get us out of where we are. It's investing in local people and building up an infrastructure and ecosystem that, as Jessica Norwood, my dear friend, would say, like, loves Black and brown people. Like, that's what's going to get us out of this. So we do our community assessment, and if it's a go, then we look at the financial risk. But we look at the financial risk from the risk that the investor has the privilege to take, as opposed to laying everything onto the project of like a repayment risk. So we look at it like a regeneration expectation. Like, how much of the money are we putting into the community that's going to come back that we can regenerate, that can be regenerated over time? I have to give a credit to Amaka for that beautiful language reframe. And then we look at the financial risk. So a lot of it is also just around understanding people should be allowed to make mistakes and fail. Like, if the project is being called for by the community, if the community has the capacity to do it, awesome. If they don't, what do they need? If they get what they need, what are the chances that it will be successful in terms of community impact? And if it's not, are they willing to share those stories so that people can learn from that and move forward? So yeah, it's been I just basically took all of Amaka's beautiful wisdom and just put it into a bunch of tables and asked some questions. But we're really excited to be able to share this with everybody because it really is a different way of thinking. And as we think about the moment we're in and in the convergence of everything, like I was tweeting the other day about how we're in a depression and somebody asked me, how do we get out of this? I'm like, through collectivism, being community minded. That's how it survives us. So I was there. Thanks.
And Nasa, could I add 2 cents? Sorry, I'll be super quick. I just want to underscore one of the things that Lynn really teased out or implied when she was speaking. Part of what allows us to engage in those conversations around the sticking points in a project is that we work to build relationships with communities authentic ground. And so these are relationships that many of us have held for years. I really modeled this with the way Chorus has done a lot of their grant making. Being able to be in that trusted relation is what allows folks to actually name what they truly, and then allows us to lean into, well, how can we support you? So we regard ourselves, we've been kind of playing with the terminology, practice-based funders. Being people that kind of, Lynn, as she mentioned, coming out of banker's experience, myself coming out of grassroots organizing and working with projects on the ground to understand aspects of economic development is what allows us to show up and ask the questions that need to be asked in a way that people feel that they can trust us and know that we're not asking as an excuse to kind of deny them access to funding, but if we're already bought into their vision, the question is, how can we best support you to take it to the next level?
And I just want to publicly thank the 2 of you, not just for your financial support, but for like having kinds of conversations with me over the last year or so to say, as a testament to how successful it is, Historic Claiborne Temple got its final go-ahead from the National Park Service for historic preservation construction today. So like, this is working, it's working, it's working. I want to turn the conversation to you, Erin, because like folks have said multiple times, this is not just about building financial power in communities. It's also about building political power and sovereignty. And one of the things that I love talking to you about as we look to the future of Historic Claiborne, future of the communities in Memphis and across the South that we are working to support, I want to talk to you about the Partnership Fund and what you do there, but also want you to talk a little bit about the cooperative movement, as the models that we're thinking about building in Claiborne Temple, we're experimenting with cooperative about how to leverage that economic power for political power, and that is like your name. So can you please talk to us about that? School Great Mother, please give us the wisdom.
First, I just want to give a deep gratitude to everyone on the phone and thank this coordinating team, Taj and Kat, all of you all for your labor at NASA. I want to thank Namaka and Lynn for their leadership, for the framework that is guiding a lot of our work and helping us to give lens. And then I also want to give honor and thanks to the Creator and my ancestors and all of y'all's ancestors that brought us to like where we are today. And have us sort of sitting in this place and sort of invite us all to like a deep breath. My heart is pounding nearly out of my chest right now. And so I'm trying to ground myself in my body and accept, the gratitude that I feel that I'm even sitting in this conversation with you, because it's quite a lot. It takes a lot to kind of get into these conversations, figure out where they are and what they mean and learn about them. And so to just have folks willing to even support me in my leadership to do that, I just want to give thanks. So I'm Erin Dale, and the executive director of the Partner, which is a foundation focused on building independent political power for communities closest to the pain and shifting this entire system, like world reversal really, so that those closest to the pain there with the power. And I believe, and I think we as the Partnership Fund believes, that there are systems and structures and ways of organizing resources to build power. If you're shifting resources and power isn't being built, then you're maintaining the status quo. And the challenge in figuring out how to do this in a way that lands in human beings. And when I say actual human beings, I literally mean like I shop at Food Line and think, how does the grocery store clerk at Food Line become the board chair of my co-op? I'm not really focusing on the board leaders, a lot of people that are already leaders in community and have access. The question is, how does the everyday person doing the work that they do move into a leadership and governing position collectively with others? Kat said at the beginning, build the beloved community and hold it in common. And I think at the partnership ones, we believe that's possible. We believe it has to do with our organization started in 2014, and it really focused on building ecosystems into governing power. And it focused on investing first in membership-based organizations. And these are organizations whereby the actual member would articulate being a member. You might be like, what does that mean here? Organizations will say, we have 5 million members, but if you were to talk to them, the members themselves would be like, I don't know this organization. And it's something like on when you're talking about what is membership, I mean the actual human being, the person themselves says, I'm a member of Fertile Ground, I'm a member of Claiborne Temple, I'm a member of Society of Clotilda, and they're proud of it. And this is the type, that's what we mean, that's what I mean when I say building power. So I want to start there with that kind of explanation, because a lot of times we invest in infrastructures that actually don't end up moving the resources to the community so that they are, and that is a reflection of the structures of the organizations themselves. Sometimes not even their heart. I think a lot of that has to do with sometimes how they're structured. And we have a lot more conversation about that. So the partnership funds invested in membership-based organizations and their closest allies. They provided general operating support, multi-year, to the entire ecosystem and a number of states. And those states were Virginia, New Mexico, Ohio, Michigan, also now Florida and Missouri. This idea of the ecosystem approach essentially means that you're building a cohort of folks in deep relationship that move into governing power, and that you do that in a way in which you support and you trust them to do the work because they are closest to the pain and they live there. You're nowhere near there. What do you know? So we believe in shifting structure so that the people to the power have the decision-making authority, the budget authority to then make decisions for their own communities on their own behalf, trust them to do that work. And I think the experience at the Partnership Fund, I would say we've proven to ourselves and to the grantees that we work with that that strategy works. Because you're investing in experts. The question is how to replicate the ecosystem model in places that aren't getting the same level of investment. The partnership funds work started with really states that had majority, you know, Minnesota as an example is a diverse state. That ecosystem, that political progressive ecosystem, diversification and inclusion work across the country, we still have a ways to go. So the question of building those ecosystems in Black and Brown is gender non-conforming, non-binary communities as leaders and investing in them, determining who their ecosystem partners are, and then them moving into a governing stance because they have members that have moved to leadership over time that they now run the thing. This is ultimately what we have been doing as an ecosystem. I became the director in last year. So June 10th was my year anniversary. Add that a few other things that are, thank you, a few other things that are gaps when I came on that we're working also to address. The partnership funds in December, and I went to honor my board, Keisha Gaskins of Rockefeller Fund and Dental Services, and I can send a list. I won't have funders, but I will say that my board decided and supported moving into a different structure whereby they share power with folks on the ground. So we're actually changing the structure of our foundation. The Partnership Fund had no website, had no application process, but it was political power. How do you do that without being accountable? I'm not sure. And so the question of accountability with the grantees on the ground, which means sharing power, which means they also get to decide, we're moving into that structure. The second gap that we identified is this question of independent resource generation. Some folks may have heard of the work that Saldago and Guillermo and folks are doing. Amalgamated, I guess, Bank is now doing some of that work. But this idea of investing in membership organizations so that they can create the economic end to become self-sufficient and independent into perpetuity is also a strategy that we're supporting and that the board has agreed, and studying with our grantees to understand what that would mean for us. But essentially what we believe is that unless the people in the communities are able to generate their own resources over time into perpetuity, they'll always be beholden on this failed charity model. I was taking notes. I said, oh, charity, who is a sign of failure. Oh my. So I want to thank you for that today. And just, I agree 100%. And so now 1,000,000%. And so then if we don't create the paths for organizations to move into independence, where that's their own enterprise or membership strategy or whatever, quite frankly, it's what the member organizations themselves want, envision, and dream. And to get to that place, the organizations have to have the resources to create the space to have those conversations. And that we believe that investing in that strategy will help the organizations to become independent on their own. The last thing I want to talk about is that the Partnership Fund is doing with the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, ASHEAHO. I want to lift them up, and I want to tell all of you, welcome to Reparation Summer. You can look it up online. There's a link. It is Reparation Summer. And this idea that it's time to shift resources to Black-led organizations on the ground and in the community, and Indigenous organizations themselves. I'm honored to be the president of Fertile Ground Food Cooperative. And I'm a member of the resurging Black movement. And I lift up the Gem City Co-op, Little Africa, Solo. I could go on and on. Cooperative efforts across the country where Black folks have come together to meet their needs because the system was never trying to do so. And what the work at the Partnership Funds now has also begun to do is to work with cooperatives to develop a fund that they govern, where we'll be able to invest in civic engagement strategies that the cooperatives can use to increase their member voter turnout, increase their power building strategies with civic engagement funding. Now, the civic engagement funding is typically funding that gets people out to vote. I didn't introduce myself as Grand Blueprint North Carolina. I'm on the board Voices. Spent many years focusing on increasing voter turnout. And I consider myself an expert in recovery. Some of y'all was like, woo! That's exactly how I feel. And I feel a great amount of anger and fury at the civic engagement movement for pushing Black people out to vote and giving them very little, if ever, if nothing in return, over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And they'll be doing it all. They're doing it now. You all remember it's coming. We know what that's about. But I would say increased voter turnout, which I'm an expert, does never really results in transformative Black power for Black people. That's not a real thing. And so the question of how civic engagement strategies increase power and base organizations, I believe the cooperative approach is one of that, because cooperatives are run one person and one vote. We share membership, we share assets, and we're all equal owners in this organization. So essentially we have 400 owners. Actually, we have nearly 600 owners cooperative. And as we grow in our strength assets, our owners are growing because we collectively govern those resources. There's a book, show one picture that I want to show on my screen. Look at this, they let me share the screen. This is a little beautiful mural from the partnership funds. And this is the image I want to share. It says the history of the African American cooperativism is really a parallel, a sort of silent partner to the long civil rights movement. The story is not just about the triumph and survival of co-ops in the Black community, but it's also about sabotage and challenge. And this is a quote by Jessica Gordon Nimhart, who wrote a book called Collective Courage, which is the history of Black cooperative thought and practice, a guiding light in the cooperative movement at this moment. And we want to lift her name up for her great work. I just want to say this. There's some readings that I think Tosh can send out to give folks more information about the strategy. I believe I'm a serious cooperator because I believe that the structure of organizations that build power must actually create equitable relationship and must share risk and share advantage among owners and the people in the organization, and ultimately allow us to grow our base and grow our base and grow our base. And this a cooperative approach to building Black independent political power is really an effort to create a national network for the Black cooperative movement, because we have none of that. We have not got national infrastructure at scale. So I want to say thank you, Tosh, for the time, and let you move forward. I don't know if there's questions, Anasa, or anything. I appreciate this time.
We are gonna turn back over to you, Taj. We're actually gonna have a few more questions for y'all a bit later, both from Taj and from the audience too. So thank all three of you for everything you've done for Memphis and for Claiborne and for me personally. And welcome to the Regenesis webinar family.
Rachel, my sister Rachel texted happy. I could not be happier right now in this conversation. Let me tell you. The thing that did not get shared is that they got a plan for the South, and the things that Amaka and Lynn are supporting in Memphis, as Anasa said, those things are going to move south, and Harold is right there to do everything he can as a former state legislator and a leader in Black state legislative networks, and someone who's may have a significant role in the next administration related to some of these questions. Harold is bringing some support. So this is things happen in the South, because as we know, as the South goes, right? And if you didn't figure that out right now this year, then you'll never figure it out, because woo-wee, that Civil War thing seemed to have ended. Some people didn't, and they seem to be fighting it. So that's enough of that. I'm excited. Now we're going to hear from Farhad, and he's going to tell you a bedtime story. who is our Morpheus, and I'll tell you a thing about that. But the things that you said, Kat, that you invited folks into, Farhad's the person who's just like been making the leaps, just jump in from building to building and say, it's easy, jump. You can do it. If I can do it, you can do it too. So we're going to hear from Morpheus about what it took to make the big leap.
Thank you so much, Taj, and thank you, everybody. This has been really amazing. And I'm a bit overwhelmed, but in a good way. Hey y'all, I'm Farhad Hakimi. I am the founder of the Chorus Foundation. I come to this conversation through family philanthropy as a member of a wealthy family, but identity can be complex sometimes. And we're also a refugee family. Both my parents are refugees, my father from Iran and my mom from Cuba. And so as I've navigated all these spaces in philanthropy, even from when I was quite young, this notion that we've already discussed so much of community self-determination always really resonated for me, because in many ways I see my parents' refugee experiences as an example of what happens when self-determination was denied in the places where they grew up. So the Chorus Foundation was started about 15 years ago. I committed all the financial resources under my control. And it has evolved over time from admittedly starting with a pretty conventional issue focus on climate change to really shifting to being about supporting the building of power for transformative change. That's about what we fund in terms of efforts to build, as has been said, political, economic, and cultural power, particularly in communities that historically had power wielded against them. Black communities, indigenous communities, immigrants and refugees of color, working class white communities. And we've also applied that criteria to our investment as well. The criteria for investment is not ROI to us. It's about our community. But it's not just what we support, it's how we support it. And so the line of inquiry around holding power accountably as the baseline and really opportunities to share power equitably and ultimately find ways to let go of power entirely about. And that's also how we invest, or increasingly how we don't invest, because we challenge the idea that we as an institution created by a wealthy family should get to be the investor. So we're a spend down foundation. We started with admittedly vague line of inquiry around sunsetting 15 years ago with the creation of the foundation. We're galvanized by the urgency of the climate crisis, as well as other crises we might mention in our politics and in our economy. But we come to see ourselves as a transitional form. The reason that we're spending down is because we're not the right model. That if we social movements that another world is possible, then we need to ask ourselves, what does resource allocation look like in that world? Because I don't think it looks like private philanthropy. What does investment look like in that world? Because I don't think it looks like people like me continuing to see the return on investment. And so we believe very much in this idea of a just transition for the philanthropic sector, which means not only investing in and supporting models of resource allocation and investment, but supporting the political, economic, and cultural power of communities so that the resources are not extracted and consolidated in the first place. That we're both helping communities be less dependent on philanthropy, and we're also cutting private philanthropy off at the knees, saying you get less money in the first place. So our approach has an emphasis on place, anchored by long-term general operating commitments to anchor organizations. When I say long-term, I'm not talking about 3 years. I'm talking about through our spend down. So we made 8 to 10 year general operating commitments to organizations, basically saying we will fund you until we run out of money and can't fund you anymore. But we also believe in supporting the transformative change ecosystems that are always going to be bigger than those charismatic anchor institutions whose EDs folks know. So in every place where we fund, we also have a line of inquiry around democratized decision-making. It is just that. It's a line of inquiry. It takes time. It's relationships. It's about building trust. It's iterative. Didn't involve, for example, just showing up in rural Alaska and saying the magic words, participatory budgeting, and assuming that everybody was going to be down for it. It's about perhaps more conventional philanthropy of our staff and our board making big decisions around those long-term commitments, and then building trust over time can start to explore things like participatory budgeting so that we can support our grantees to create things like grassroots intermediaries or financial cooperatives or whatever their vision is for their own infrastructure or resource allocation and investment. And ultimately, the goal is to support folks to create structures and processes that will outlive the foundation for both grant making and investment. We deeply believe in supporting community organizing, for providing resources for staff time for folks who are building political, economic, and cultural power. But it's also about how we are providing not just consumptive, but productive units of economic support for grantees, helping them acquire land, helping them acquire buildings, helping them acquire the means of production, seeding their loan so that it's not just about paying for staff time. And then once that is up, for more resources, for more staff time. And I'll just close out in saying that for me personally, the importance of culture shift in all of this has been that getting myself to a point where I now see letting go of power is not scary, but deeply liberating. No longer trying to seem like the smartest person in the room when it comes to what the political or economic strategy is or which group should get how much money, but rather knowing that my own role is as a funder organizer and as a fundraiser. So developing leadership in philanthropy and campaigning in philanthropy, doing all those kinds of things, that's where I get to try to seem smart and charismatic and my own strategic ideas. But the like grant making and investment work that we used to do that is now held by community organizations and community members, that was actually not my work to do. And the process where I no longer have to be an expert in spaces that I'm not, or that I know a lot about communities in which I've never lived, letting has been deeply, deeply liberating. And I'll leave it on that note.
Thanks, Farhad. So many thoughts, but I will hold your thoughts. Don't get too excited here. Next, we're going to hear from Sarah, my dear sister and friend, Sarah Eaglehart, who has some stories to share about work that she's doing to support Indigenous women-led work in Indian country around healing, around civic engagement, around climate, and around restorative development. And the questions in this moment, as folks are coming to realize how we got to where we are, and some of the things that need to be addressed and repaired. Sarah is supporting networks of leaders and communities who are doing really exciting work. And so Sarah wanted to give you a chance to share a little story about how that work's unfolding, and in particular pivot in this moment from the COVID relief fund that you've built and the work you've done just to get PPE to communities that can't access, Native communities that can't access it, to thinking about what are some of the longer term economic strategies, like Farhad was just mentioning, of just like, yes, we're going to make grants, but means of production, return the land, soil, assets, things that communities can use to sustain themselves and break some of those relationships of dependency, which power really loves to keep us all in. Sarah.
Sure. Absolutely. Thanks, Taj. Ampeti Washte, Wami Shinomi Amatiapi, Tante Washte, Chiazape. I greet you with a good heart. My Lakota name is Eagle Shawl Woman. I'm Ogallala Lakota. I was raised on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota, and have lived all over the country, including the South, and Florida, as well as, LA, and I'm kind of full circle back into South Dakota again. And I'm just coming off of, the last protests that we had with, 45 coming to Mount Rushmore and showing up and celebrating the desecration of sacred sites, and in the process, supporting the movement of people that were standing against this action, and also bringing awareness to the fact that the land of the Black Hills, the Pahasapa, are sacred lands of the Ochi, and the Lakota, Nakota, Dakota tribes, that are by legal right belong. We have never ceded this land ever. We never accepted any land ever. And so, if ever there was a place for, land return, it would be the Black Hills of South Dakota. So all that to say is that, I'm somebody who has naturally been an activist and an advocate in my life and career. I protested at age 16 against mascots. My own high school, that was a border town high school, had a warrior mascot that had a chief, a medicine man, and 5 warrior princesses who enacted this whole play where the women sat around a circle singing Indian love song, and the medicine man danced around the women and chose a woman by looking into their mouth and their ears, petting their hair, and like manually weighing them to stand them up. I share that because I knew that it was wrong at age 16. Now finally that the NFL team is beginning to realize that this is wrong. But at that young age, it took me and my twin sister, I have an identical twin sister therapist, we knew at this very young age. And I think that, of course, nobody wanted to listen to us. And then we had to fight for those 4 years to get them to try to stop mascot. They stopped the homecoming ceremony because they got tired of us coming back every year. And they kept the mascot the Warriors. But of course, when you think about the NFL team keeping that mascot, I personally am not celebrating, because I think that to leave the decision in the hands of an NFL brand is completely ridiculous to me. And I absolutely do not trust them to know what to do, what's right by Native Americans, or how to represent in any way. So when we're talking about culture shift and we're talking about narrative change, I personally hold that up as one of the key ingredients for the success of any practice, because for Indigenous peoples, we really do have to do like 10 times more work in order to get the same opportunity that many other groups already have. So we have to educate them about our history, then the culture, then the context, and then we have to make the case. And so for us at Return to the Heart Foundation, we really felt that it was important to support Indigenous women-led initiatives, because so many of these women are, they're the epicenter of their communities. They're the heart of their community. They're already teaching the culture, about the dance, about the language. They're already, creating this world that they want to see. But at the same time, they're fighting against things that are health. It's like they're against death. So they're like they're doing something fun. Of course, they were organizing around climate justice. Of course, they were organizing around, get out the vote. Of course, they took on COVID because they knew that they had to save their communities, right? And so when you think about all of the things that are up against them in order for them to have the same opportunity that many other groups have, it's just immense. And then when you think about the networking that it takes, oftentimes I'm the only Native person in many of the spaces. And I started thinking to myself, okay, how do we create more women that are the grassroots voices that are doing the work in their community, but they also need a support network with each other as well as with a larger group and community. So that's what I've been really excited to build at Return to the Heart Foundation. And so yes, as Native women, we recognize that healing is central to economic development and that is really important in supporting the priorities and projects that lead to generational change. And this means the healing of the land, the healing of generations, the healing of relationships. That's the heart of our approach to economic development. And we also believe it's important to address the deep economic challenges that face Native communities, and we must dig into the root causes, as well as support the leadership, creativity, entrepreneurship, and economic development of Native women who can lead the solutions in their own community. So our vision is really to open those doors that haven't been opened before, to innovate and catalyze Native women-led economic business activity, and expand access to capital, increasing asset development, and expanding local employment opportunities. And so, yeah, I give you like a little snippet because I could go on forever, but I know that we have a lot to get through. So I'm excited to get into like the kitchen table.
Me too. And thank you for sharing, Sarah. So when we were planning this webinar, the list of people we were wanting literally was like 25 people, because there's so much exciting work that's happening around shifting capital and the way you all are talking about it, and putting it where it needs to go. That thank you. There's a lot of stories to tell, and I'm gonna sort of get us in our kitchen table configuration here. So this is going to be a chance for the folks who've been sharing and the folks who haven't shared yet to kind of just have some conversation with each other. And, this is a moment where we kind of want to, before you all are kind of the leading edge of the leading edge in this work. You are the innovators of the innovators. And so this is a unique opportunity to think about like how we can push each other to go even further, to go even bigger, to go even better in our relationships with our movement partners and communities to make these shifts happen. But the question we want to start with is we've been talking a lot about moment, or this aspect of for those who are who are capital stewards, who have decision-making power and control over resources, that, as you know, Kat said, and many of you had noted, the dominant way that those relationships are held is in a relationship of charity or investment, right? And that's a relationship essentially of control, right? Fundamentally a relationship of control. And so in the context of just transition in philanthropy and capital, there's a lot of discussion about the importance of just like letting go of the control, right? And, you know, Farhad is someone who's done that, and Kat, as you're thinking about kind of on a human development basis and on a family basis, can you know, be curious to hear from both of you a little bit about, like, what did it take to get to that point where you're just like, okay, like I've got this, but I'm realizing I need to shift the control of these resources and put it back into the hands of other people. What's that journey like for each of you, and what advice do you have who are maybe listening or going to watch this later on and are intrigued by the possibility of that?
Fine, do you want to go first? You're further along.
Well, I think a deep discomfort with the well is a great place for me to start. I was not the wealth earner, and I had trouble reconciling aspects of my parents' politics that very much resonated for me. We were anti-imperialist, we were anti-colonialist, you know, watching the news about the Cold War or things like that when I was a kid in the 80s, like that was political education for me. And then it was a little bit later when I was like, why don't we ever talk about class or capitalism at all? Because I see some repeated themes, right? But I do think that there was a big part of me nonetheless that felt like I had to learn how to be a steward of these resources in a sort of a sense. I had to learn to become a mainstream investor. I had to become a successful entrepreneur, because like, wouldn't I be letting my parents down, or you know, would I just be somebody who was squandering the resources if I did anything else? And so it was very important to me to be able to, with folks who were further along than I, or even folks who were just like at exactly the same point that I was and were wrestling with the same questions. So everything from being able to connect with folks in places like Resource Generation to, connecting with Marnie and Ed from Fund for Democratic Communities, were just other folks out there who were wrestling with the same stuff. And that showed me that it was possible to respond in a way that was commensurate to the responsibility, right? That wasn't like putting off the importance of it all, but was also taking a totally different direction than what our established preconceiveds in our society tell us about money and investment and things like that.
Thanks, Farhad. Kat, any reflections?
Yeah. So yes, so I think it's probably really different for the person who made the money, and I don't control our assets yet. I control a portion of them, and it's quite personal. You know, we have a partner who maybe in a different place a little bit, but I have a partner who is simply more liberal over his life, starting as liberal. So it's sort of the form of the money also helps the transition of the opinions and ideology, which I think is part of the process. And I am learning a lot from other people, but recognizing that there's a pride thing in this too. Like, I have a great investment track record, and I don't really want to screw that up by, investing in something that's higher risk. But honestly, I'm ready to move beyond investment. First of all, I think everybody's coach on this call, and it's true, the community is way ahead of us. They know what they need. They know how to get it done. So I should trust them. They are the best risk managers. And also, you probably noticed that PayPal committed, I think, $500 million to investing in Black and brown businesses. And my first thought was, you should give equity grants to the founders of those businesses so they have more equity in their own business, who wants PayPal? So no offense, but as an owner of your business, that is antithetical to community control and individual wealth building. So I went from banking to venture to philanthropy, and I'm going to merge them all, and I'm going to try to make more equity grants to Black and female and everyone else, all the entrepreneurs who know what their communities need and how to build it.
Thanks, Kat. I think that there's so much in that, and I just want to point folks to the Swift Foundation, and Justice Funders has a learning series that they've done, and I shared a link in the chat, which Amaka was a part of, and some other stations were happening in a really like powerful and useful way. So if this is the part of conversation you're really finding engaging, there's that resource in the chat and the resource page. And Justice Funders is going to be doing a 3-part series talking about the lessons coming out of the Maestra program, which Amaka can also talk about. And the Maestra program has a framework around just that's really kind of analysts do. So I think that like Maestra and Justice Funders is a really good resource for some of these things. And another amazing resource, speaking of, is Resource Generation, because Resource Generation is a community of asset holders and wealth holders who support each other to work through this stuff. So I want to bring you into the conversation, Rachel.
With my RG hat on.
Rachel,
Yeah.
with your RG hat on and your RNP hat on. And,
all of the hats.
Yeah, sure. Any thoughts on, sort of, you just came out of you and Amaka just came out of a Resource Generation board meeting before this. So anything you want to share about this question and just kind of add to the overall conversation about the shifting strategies that we're in?
Absolutely. So I'm Rachel Robichauty. I founded and continue to lead Robichauty and Phillips, and our impact investing strategy is RISE. We're a investment management, and we call ourselves a financial activism firm. And I am the Resource Generation board treasurer right now. So, but I think it's a really interesting question about giving up control. I love what Farhad had to say about it, because I felt exactly the same way. Investment manager, I don't get to be in meetings like this as often as I would like. I spend about half of my time in meetings with people from the financial industry, which is extractive. But what we're doing is within that industry, we're developing deep relationships with impacted communities and the social justice movements that come from within those communities. And they are setting the standard for what our impact should be. And so we see ourselves as that transitional capital. And it's an amazing thing in the finance industry. Nobody understands why we were decision making about what the impact should be to impacted communities. And yet by the same token, we frequently get people say, how have you had such amazing impact? No one has impact, that quickly. And I'm like, well, because communities actually know what they need. So built a system for divesting on the stock market side. So like there's a way that you can divest strategically and in other values aligned investors. And then we have an investment strategy that's about investing directly into the Black community in the United States via municipal bond strategy, where we have community folks on the ground that are helping us to direct the capital within those communities that receive the funds. That one's just launched this week. And so I think that for me, it's really about do you want to do things that work? And if you want to do things that work, and everyone wants to know the secret sauce. Bloomberg, and they ask all the time, what's the secret sauce? How have you made so much change? And I'm like, it's really actually listening to people that the investment managers don't normally have relationships with, which is revolutionary. And it's good training on our way to a regenerative economy to say, okay, well, you need access to your money, you need liquidity, you need diversification to bring down the risk. Great, but let's do that in a way that's, stops the harm as much as possible and is also funding our communities directly. Oh, you're muted.
So we defaulted towards the stories, which leave time for the kitchen table. But as I said, I think for folks here, I hope you get a sense that we have expertise across all all forms of capital, like detailed expertise, through which we can build a whole new financial system, a whole new economy. Like it exists. It's there. It's the dedication, the focus, the creativity. It's all there. And I think, and I'm hoping this conversation is going to help us to collectively catch up with the communities in the ways that we need to, because there are some innovators, but we need, as Fundra would say, we need to grow the choir. We need more people to become a part of this process in a good way. So the way we're going to close out is we're going to close out with call-ins. And so the way a call-in, and then we're just going to do a quick round, and timing wise, everyone should just like say a sentence. Nick is going to put up a slide with some call-ins, and essentially we're in a moment in which to as Harold just informed you, there's a couple $1 trillion just related to kind of Green New Deal investment that's going to become available. And the consistent pattern with all forms of economic stimulus is that it doesn't come to our communities. 2008, the GI Bill, like I could go on, but all the time, stimulus doesn't get to our communities. So the private capital we're talking about right now is about investing millions in community capacity to shift billions to absorb trillions, because literally trillions of dollars are going to be moving, and our communities need the investment so they can build the capacities to absorb those resources. So right now, as I was making a list for this call, there are 8 or so plans that are happening where folks on this call are trying to raise and move capital at the scale of about $100 million at a time into communities. So the Movement for Black Lives has put out a call for $50 million as the first phase of their capital needs for what that movement needs to do. And what they're going to need is at least double that soon. You heard from Rakia and Christina last week around the work to shift resources to alternatives in policing and prisons, and there's about $200 million that's needed for that. Rachel needs $200 million for the bond product she's working on to put resources into Black communities with partnership with Activest. There's a network of birth center equity leaders who are trying to build birthing capacity. So we've got, and this is not the whole list, but part of why we wanted to share this in context to the slides that were put up earlier about resources in the hundreds of billions and trillions of scale, right? 300 billion essentially in the prisons and policing industrial complex, 300 billion, right? We've got to divest at a much quicker pace, and we got to shift community assets and capital at a much more rapid pace if we're gonna deal with the crisis that we're in. So these call-ins sort of speak to that, but I'll pause there and I'll just open it up because we are at time to see if anyone else has any additional call-ins they wanna throw out before we close.
How do people follow up? Like, how do people respond to these call-ins?
So there's a what's here is in the resource document that I shared at the beginning of the call, and we'll share at the end. It's the next slide that comes. And if you go there, there's essentially links to all of those efforts and how to connect to them. And if you are a part of an effort to try to organize and shift capital at some more significant scale, please let us know so we can support you, because that's what this circle is gathered to do, to get serious about the divestment and the return of assets to community ownership, stewardship, management, and control, so that we can live the good life in the Buen Vir. Mm-hmm. So I'll leave it there because I don't want to keep people here too much longer than I could stay here all day, but I know y'all have meals to cook and things to do. But
Hi.
Kat, any last words before we
Yeah.
close?
It's Kat, and my call out to myself is to think about how to at least half my DAFs. Mostly we spend our DAFs down pretty fast, like same year often and stuff. But think creatively about how the assets in the DAF that the DAF represents can be pledged or somehow invested and put to use for creating wealth in Black and Brown communities. And I know Fred called, but I might give you a call, Fred Blackwell, and figure out how we can do something like that together.
It's a great place to start. And I know you also are helping to raise 15 million for regenerative agriculture. So if you're working on regenerative agriculture, talk to Kat on that. She's trying to move resources to communities in that way.
Thanks. Fred just said yes. Yay.
All right. Got a deal. All right, beautiful people. This was, you know, as you could probably see, this is like this made my life, my year, to get a chance to learn from and spend some time with people who I've learned so much from already, and who I'm excited for everyone on this call, coming out of this call, to think about how we can more deeply collaborate in this shared endeavor, along with all of you who've joined in the webinar and shared your questions. This is definitely a Zoom chat that we're going to download and share, because there's people shared a lot of really amazing resources and insights there as well. So thank you for taking time to contribute there. The next conversation is going to be about regenerative agriculture. We're looking for a date for the next one, but we'll let you know when that gets landed. So thank you all.
Hey, thank you, Tosh. Appreciate everything you did, all y'all, for your work today. We should thank you all for your organizing work as well.
Yeah, thank
Appreciate you for that.
Yeah, thanks to Kaylee for getting us organized, and Nick for getting our questions together, and Harold for keeping us on track, and Anasa for always bringing the magic. So yeah, this has been beautiful.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Right.